All right, guys, welcome back to another episode. So today we're
slavery.
Guys, we have another video from Thomas Sowell, and this is discussing. It says facts about slavery never mentioned in school.
Did you learn about slavery in school?
So I learned about slavery in school, but I felt like I learned like the censored version of it because it wasn't until like even in college. I didn't learn about like the real facts of slavery, and the only way I kind of learned extra material was when I started reading other books into what was going on. Because I think for Black people, especially in America, when we hear the word slavery, we instantly relate it to the transatlantic slave trade. And
well, that's what we're taught.
Right, exactly. And so a lot of people don't know that slavery was actually going on all around the world. Yeah. And even when it ended in America, it was still going on over in the Middle East.
Yeah, it does make me feel some type of way because being taught that your ancestors were slaves and that's all y'all were.
Oh, yeah,
It gives me an icky feeling. Plus, you know, they kind of glazed over it in elementary school, but in high school, we did have African American studies as an elective.
Really? Y'all had that?
Yeah, it was like an elective like Spanish.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so
were people taking it?
Yeah, I took it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a few people taking it, and
any white people were taking it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean it's history. Everybody wants to learn history, but I still feel like they glazed over it a little bit. But I really feel like they should teach history, world history in school, and not just certain aspects of history.
Now, you know what? I do agree with you on that. I think that if people are going to teach history, if schools are going to teach history, they need to teach it in its entirety so that people can kind of understand, not only understand where they are, but understand when they are.
Ooh, I like that.
But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this video. Let's see what he's talking about. Let's bring this display up. Let's go.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
Wow.
All right. What do you think so far?
It's interesting.
Yes. Very interesting. Now, it's something that I've kind of known from doing my own personal reading, which was, you know, when countries would go to war, when people would go to war, when tribes would go to war, whenever they would conquer their enemy, they would take them as slaves.
Yeah.
And that made sense because why am I going to work the farm? And I just subjugated you guys. I killed all your king or your men or whatever. and y'all can, do the work.
But also, West Africans were sold by other West Africans.
Yeah.
To other countries.
Yeah.
As well, and I feel like that topic isn't.
It's not
brought up to or discussed
right
as
there,
much.
and it's funny because there's a lot of things that aren't discussed when it comes to this topic.
But also, I you might have to cut this out. I don't know, but a lot of times when this is cringy to say, when you have other cultures like that you interact with at school, particularly elementary, high school, and this is always brought up. Well, at least my ancestors weren't slaves.
Ooh, yes.
By other Africans.
This would be, yes. All right, now, I don't know if this happens, if you guys are watching, if you're a different race, if you're white, Asian, Latino, or whatever, but something that happens with black people a lot, whenever somebody is criticizing you or they're talking about you, they'll always say something like, at least my ancestors weren't slaves.
I hear this from...
You know what the truth is? They were.
I just have so many stories, and a lot of times it's unprovoked.
Yeah.
And if you feel like this story isn't necessary, you can cut it out. But I remember going salsa dancing one night, and I hate to bring up this conversation because people always deny it. And we were just talking, and there was a guy. He seemed like a nice guy. He was like, "Oh, you dance very well. Where are you from?" And I'm like, "I'm American." He was like, "Oh, I'm from Cuba." And he said to my friend, "Well, my people weren't slaves." In this conversation, I am not exaggerating. And I was like, what? But even being younger, and this is not to say all people do it, but this topic comes up a lot, even from East Africans. They would say, "Oh, well, at least my people weren't slaves. They were king and queens."
Yeah, right.
And it really hurt because we were deduced only to our ancestors being slaves, not accomplishing anything else. And then they teach it in school.
Right, yeah.
And I was not familiar with East Africans being enslaved by Arabs.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Right. That's how...
And maybe they didn't either.
Right, yeah. That's how Islam spread across Africa.
Wow.
Through slavery, right? Let's go ahead and continue.
The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objection.
Oh, man. All right, do you remember watching Roots as a kid?
They
would have marathons, and they would show Roots all day long.
I never finished watching the movie.
Okay.
I never finished watching the movie.
Oh, man. I remember watching it and believing it was like the real story of Kunta Kinte. And, oh, man, wow.
As other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. And the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom.
Wow.
Pause.
Yeah.
You know what was interesting? It was interesting, and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this too. A lot of times when we talk about Africans being enslaved, a lot of people always talk about how we were living in peace with one another, and that seems far from the truth.
Yeah, and that is because of the educational system and how they indoctrinate people with people with history. Because
kumbaya.
I think throughout history, no man has ever lived in peace. There has always been tribes conquering other tribes, pillaging, R-wording. I can't say it, but it's something that has always gone on throughout history, and we're just kind of blind to it because they don't teach real history in school.
It's like, we was just like living in harmony and peace.
Because they said the same, but they said the same thing about community. Like the Native Americans, and they were,
but that's another video,
right? Yeah.
We're not gonna talk about
yeah.
It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Wow. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
1/3? Wow.
Don't
Blacks
say nothing about that.
Slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean.
But there was, I don't know if you remember that Different World episode where Whitley Gilbert found out that her ancestors were slave owners.
Oh, yeah. No, I didn't.
And that was like the first time I heard about black people owning slaves.
Wow.
But I didn't think I didn't think they fought in the Civil War.
Right.
But why wouldn't they?
Right. When you put it in that kind of perspective, because then you have these people who are making money. Their whole livelihood, their family, their legacy is their plantation or whatever they have going on. So why wouldn't they defend that?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And I think that was the case for a lot of people. They just didn't want the institution to go away because, of course, if slavery is abolished, it's a business. Wow. And it's so crazy because we think about like how people would feel when there's like a moral obligation or even an ethical obligation. But when it comes to business, especially when you're like a shrewd business person, moral and ethical issues kind of go out the window, and you start thinking about profit, and you start thinking about money, and you think about your legacy. There's a lot of self-interest involved.
I definitely want to find out who these 10 black slave owners were.
Yeah, maybe we'll do another video and we can kind of explore that. That'd be interesting. Let me take it back a second.
And thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Wow. All right, so what'd you think?
Very informative. Just like a shock.
Yeah.
And now it makes me think, why don't they teach this? Like, is there something behind teaching children this is your history and this is your only history, and teaching them lies? Because it made me feel some type of way, like, only your ancestors were slaves, you're nothing more than descendants of slaves.
Right.
And what do you expect to get out of a person who feels that way?
You know, I don't necessarily feel like it's lies that they're teaching, but it's more like half-truths. And they're
Which is a lie.
And they're not telling the full story, and it creates a narrative within your mind, because I think about my perception of the world growing up as a black person and knowing what I knew about slavery and how I would perceive the world, especially white people in America, because of it. And I think for a lot of black people, that's what happens. And it does cultivate a feeling of inferiority complex. And we see it all the time, every day, whether it's conscious or subconscious.
Definitely.
And we also see it within other black people in their own community, because there's issues.
The diaspora as a whole.
The diaspora as a whole, but it's something that we've talked about before, which relates to colorism. And so it's very interesting hearing this, learning more about what happened during those times, because I thought I was somewhat informed, but this let me know that there's a lot more that I need to learn.
Definitely. And I think if more people learned about it, we could have a